The Catalina Terminal at Wilmington, California, a Saturday morning in August 1938, 8:15. Rosa Morales, 34, stood on the upper deck of the SS Catalina with her husband Eduardo and their 3 children, Carmen, 12, Luis, 9, and the youngest, Elena. Watching the terminal's white-painted wharf building shrink behind them as the great white steamer swung her bow toward the open water of San Pedro Channel. The children had been talking about this crossing since May. Rosa had bought the tickets in June. Eduardo had reserved his spot at the bow rail before Carmen had finished arguing with Luis about which side of the deck faced the island. Carmen had already claimed the spot she always claimed on these crossings, the port rail, forward, close enough to the bow that the spray caught you in the face when the Catalina hit the chop of the open channel. This was not an accident. She had been claiming this specific spot since she was 7, when Eduardo had first brought the family aboard, and she had never once explained to Luis why she got there first and why it mattered. She simply arrived there before him every time and stood at the rail with a specific, practiced ownership that Luis had stopped arguing about 2 summers ago. Eduardo had chosen the 8:15 departure for the same reason he chose everything about these crossings. It was the sailing that got you to Avalon before the afternoon crowds, gave the children the full day on the island, and still had you back in Wilmington before the evening. He had been making this calculation for 5 years, since his own foreman at the cannery had described the Catalina crossing. The way one describes a thing only after you've done it several times and understood what made it worth doing again. Eduardo had done it once, understood immediately, and had been calculating his family's August Saturdays around this terminal ever since. What had Eduardo Morales learned from his foreman and from 5 summers of August crossings about what the 2.5 hours between Wilmington and Avalon gave his children that the island itself, on its own, could not give them until they had already crossed to get there? What the Morales family boarded that August morning was not simply a boat to an island. The SS Catalina had been built in 1924 specifically for the crossing that William Wrigley Jr., the chewing gum magnate who had purchased Santa Catalina Island in 1919, believed the crossing deserved. Wrigley had already put an earlier ship, the Avalon, on the route in 1920, a capable 1,625 passenger vessel that was, by his own judgment, insufficiently grand for what he intended Catalina to become. The SS Catalina was his answer, a 301-foot white-hulled steamer built at the Los Angeles Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company at a cost of $1 million, launched in 1924, and designed from the outset to carry up to 2,000 passengers at a time across the 26 miles of open Pacific water separating the port of Los Angeles from Avalon Harbor. The documentation of what she offered passengers is precise. The Los Angeles Times described boarding the Catalina in her heyday as entering a world of luxurious leather settees and gleaming teak. On the upper deck, people danced to swinging big bands. The ship carried live orchestras through her post-war peak years, and the dancing was not incidental to the crossing, but part of its specific social architecture. Magicians and clowns worked the passenger decks. Children played hide-and-seek among the lifeboats on the lower deck. Couples found private spots along the rails. And the crossing itself, 2.5 hours, 26 miles of open Pacific, with no land visible for most of it in any direction except the white shape of the ship herself, gave each of these activities the specific quality that only moving water provides. A contained world with a fixed beginning and a fixed end, in which nothing outside the ship applied. Eduardo Morales had paid for something more specific than passage to Catalina Island. He had paid for 2.5 hours in which his family's only job was to be on the ship. What did a vessel built this deliberately? Leather settees, big band on the upper deck, lifeboats serving as a children's maze, 2.5 hours of open Pacific as the price of entry, actually require of a family like the Morales? And what did Eduardo's annual August calculation tell us about what he expected the crossing to give his children that Avalon itself, reached any other way, could not? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980. What the steamer or the dayliner or the coastal tour boat actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from 2 hours on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never crossed to Catalina by steamer, what it gave a Southern California family, 2.5 hours of open Pacific between them and an island that had no other way in, is something no faster boat has ever managed to fully replace. And if your family ever took the Catalina boat, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take the SS Catalina or another island crossing where the boat was the only way across? And do you remember the arrival in Avalon, or which spot on deck was always yours? Next time on this channel, the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet, the small ferries that carried an entire Washington state region to work every morning before a single bridge ended them all. Back to the rail, by 10 o'clock, the California coastline had gone entirely behind them, and Catalina Island had not yet appeared on the horizon ahead. The Catalina was in the specific interval that Eduardo Morales had, across 5 summers, come to think of as the real point of the trip. The open water, the 26 miles of San Pedro Channel, where the only thing visible in every direction was the Pacific and the ship herself. Luis had moved from the bow rail to the lower deck, where he had spotted 2 other children his age doing what the lower deck specifically invited children to do, running among the lifeboat davits in patterns that a deck chair or a saloon or a dining table would not have accommodated. Carmen stayed at the bow rail without any interest in the davits. Elena, the youngest, had fallen asleep against Rosa's shoulder in the shade of an overhang. Eduardo stood at the rail and let the open Pacific do what it did. There were no decisions to make. The cannery schedule was back in Wilmington. Avalon was ahead of them, 2.5 hours away, with its beaches and its bay, and the specific pleasure of arriving somewhere by water that the residents of the island understood, with the particular affection of a town that depended on the boat as the right way to arrive. Between the cannery and Avalon, there was nothing but the water and the ship's specific rhythm, the roll of the hull in the channel chop, the wind that came off the open Pacific with a coolness that no August afternoon in East Los Angeles had ever offered, the sound of the orchestra on the deck above, carrying across the open water to the passengers who had not gone up to dance. This was what Eduardo had understood, after the first crossing, that his foreman had been unable to explain in words. That the value of this particular 2.5 hours was not in any of its individual components, not the orchestra, not the spray, not the children running below, but in the specific, irreplaceable fact that there was nothing else. The island was not reachable any other way. The water was the way. And the water, for 2.5 hours, required nothing of Eduardo Morales except that he be on it. What was it about an island that had no roads, no bridge, no way in except the boat, and a crossing that put 2.5 hours of open Pacific between a family and everything they had come from, that made the arrival in Avalon a different kind of arrival from any destination reachable by car? The island appeared in the way islands appear when you have been watching for them across open water, not all at once, but as a darkening of the horizon that gradually resolved into a specific shape, and then into the specific shapes of hills and buildings, and the white forms of the casino and the hotels that Wrigley had built around Avalon Harbor. By the time the Catalina was close enough that the children at the lower deck rail could see the details of the town, the harbor had already begun to perform its documented welcome. Speedboats circling the incoming ship, water skiers cutting through the ship's massive wake. And closer to shore, the smaller figures, children swimming out from the beach, waiting for the moment when passengers at the upper rail would begin tossing coins into the clear green water. Carmen had been watching for this specifically. She had coins in her dress pocket. She had asked Rosa for them 2 days ago, because she remembered the coin divers from the previous summer and had understood, the way 12-year-olds understand something that works, that she wanted to be on the giving end of it this time rather than merely watching. She had brought exactly enough coins to last until the ship docked, and she planned to make them last. Eduardo watched the arrival from the bow rail and noticed, as he noticed every year, that the feeling of pulling into Avalon Harbor on the Catalina was not the same feeling as arriving anywhere by car. The car delivered you to a parking lot, and then you walked to wherever you were going and were there. The ship delivered you to the harbor with the whole town visible, and you were still moving, and the town was coming to meet you. The speedboats, the skiers, the coin divers in the water, the people gathering at the dock. The arrival took several minutes and gave the town time to show you what it thought of your coming. No parking lot had ever done that. What did arriving at Catalina Island by boat, an arrival that the island itself treated as an event, with swimmers and skiers and singers gathered at the dock, give a family that arriving anywhere by road, at a parking lot, simply did not? Before you can fully understand what the SS Catalina gave a family like the Morales, you need to understand what made the Catalina crossing unlike almost every other American excursion boat trip. The island on the other end had no road to it. There was no bridge in 1938. There was no bridge in 1948, or 1958, or 1975. There has never been a road or bridge connecting Santa Catalina Island to the California mainland, and there is none today. This was not a temporary condition waiting to be solved by engineering. William Wrigley Jr. had deliberately declined to allow automobile access to the island from the time he purchased it in 1919, understanding, correctly as it turned out, that an island without cars was a different kind of destination from an island with them. This meant that the SS Catalina was not competing, in the way the Hudson River Day Line competed with the New Haven Railroad or the Old Bay Line competed with the Coastal Highway, against a faster or cheaper alternative to the same destination. There was no alternative to the same destination. The boat was not one option among several. It was the only option, and it had been the only option since the first commercial steamship service to Catalina began running in the 1890s. Eduardo Morales understood this, the way a man understands what he has chosen when there is only one thing to choose. He had not selected the Catalina boat over the Catalina Drive. He had selected Catalina, and the boat was what Catalina meant. The 2.5 hours were not an inconvenience on the way to the island. They were what the island cost, in time and in the specific quality of attention that moving water demands from the people crossing it. Carmen's spot at the bow rail, the coins in her pocket, Luis's path among the davits. These were not ways of passing time before the destination. They were the destination's opening chapter, the part that gave the arrival in Avalon its particular weight. What did it mean for the Morales family and for the 25 million passengers who crossed to Catalina by steamship over 5 decades, that the boat was not one option, but the only option, and that the crossing was not a prelude to the visit, but its unavoidable, structuring first act? Before you can understand what happened to the SS Catalina's post-war ridership, you need to understand what the war had done to the ship and the island both. In 1942, the U.S. Army requisitioned the Catalina, renamed her FS-99, and put her to work as a troop transport. She carried more than 800,000 soldiers and sailors Across the waters she had spent 18 years, carrying Southern California families to Avalon. Catalina Island itself was closed to civilian visitors for the duration. The island's economy contracted sharply, and the pre-war rituals, the coin divers, the speedboat welcome, the gathering at the dock, went on hold. The Catalina returned to her peacetime route in 1946, and the post-war decade brought the kind of traffic the line had not seen since its peak years. Families returning to a ritual they had put away for 4 years, and new families discovering it for the first time. More than 115,000 passengers crossed to Catalina by steamer in 1950 alone. But by 1956, that figure had dropped to just over 41,000. The Pacific Electric Big Red Car Express, the electric trolley that had connected downtown Los Angeles to the Catalina terminal in Wilmington since 1920, stopped its Catalina service in 1958. And in that same year, a 4-man vocal group called the Four Preps recorded a song called 26 Miles, Santa Catalina, that reached number 2 on the national pop charts. The island and the crossing, made famous by a record that documented, with the specific clarity of a pop song, what crossing 26 miles of open Pacific to get to Catalina Island felt like to a generation of Southern Californians who were about to stop doing it the old way. What does it mean that the Catalina crossing was declared, by a song that reached number 2 on the national charts, the specific summer longing of a generation, in the same year that the last major mainland connection to the steamer terminal shut down for good? The SS Catalina's decline was not, as in almost every other video this channel has made, the story of a bridge or a highway offering a faster route to the same destination. There was no bridge. There was no highway. The island still had no road connection to the mainland when the Catalina made her final crossing on September 14, 1975, having completed the trip exactly 9,807 times. What ended the Great White Steamer was not the arrival of a faster road, but the arrival of faster water transportation, smaller, quicker passenger ferries that could cover the 26 miles in under an hour rather than 2.5, and helicopter service that reduced the crossing to a matter of minutes. The Catalina was designated as a U.S. National Register of Historic Places landmark in 1976, the year after her retirement, a recognition that arrived, as it often does for vessels of her kind, in the specific form of honor, extended to something that was no longer functional. In 1979, she was named a California Historical Landmark and a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument. She had carried an estimated 25 million passengers in 51 years of service. The Steamship Historical Society of America documented her as having carried more passengers than any other vessel in the history of maritime travel. What happened to her after 1975 was not a story with a dignified ending. A series of owners tried to find a new purpose for a 301-foot ship that was no longer configured for the route she had been built for. She briefly became a floating discotheque. By 1997, she had run aground on a sandbar in Ensenada Harbor in Baja California, where she sat half-submerged and decaying for more than a decade. She was scrapped in 2009. The ship that had carried more passengers than any other in history, 2.5 hours at a time, 9,807 times, ended on a sandbar in a foreign harbor. What does it mean that the ship which carried 25 million people to an island that had no other way in was not replaced by a road or a bridge, but by something faster that took away the specific thing the crossing had been built around? The time? Carmen Morales took a faster passenger ferry to Catalina Island for the first time in 1966, the year after she married, with her husband and their first child. The crossing took under an hour. They were in Avalon before the child had finished his lunch. The ferry was efficient, comfortable, and exactly what it had been designed to be. What the faster ferry gave Carmen Morales: 50 minutes instead of 2.5 hours, a seat on an enclosed deck rather than a rail in the open Pacific, an arrival in Avalon that required no specific strategy about which departure to choose or where on the deck to stand, and no particular investment of the morning in anything except the crossing itself. What it did not give her: 2.5 hours of open Pacific in which the only decision was where to stand at the rail, a bow position that was worth arriving early enough to claim, the spray of the San Pedro Channel chop coming off the bow, the specific interval, open water on all sides, California behind them, Avalon not yet visible, in which her father had stood at the rail with nothing to do except be on the ship, coins to drop into the harbor water for children swimming up from below, the particular feeling of arriving at a place where the passenger's arrival was treated, by everyone in Avalon who watched the steamer come in, as an event. Carmen did not think, the first time she made the faster crossing, that anything was missing. The ferry was faster. Avalon was the same. The island still had no roads. She was there before the child had finished his lunch. It was only later, the first time her own child asked her, with the specific curiosity of children, what it had been like to cross to Catalina on the old boat, that she found her answer was not about Avalon at all, but about a spot at a bow rail and a pocket full of coins and a father who had chosen the crossing because the crossing was the point. The bow rail of the SS Catalina had known what to do with a girl standing at it for 2.5 unhurried hours. No faster ferry was ever built to ask. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more island crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded departure docks that were the best 2 hours of somebody's whole summer, and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never crossed to Catalina by steamer, what it gave a Southern California family, 2.5 hours of open Pacific between them and an island that had no other way in, is something no faster boat has ever managed to fully replace. And if you have a memory of a Catalina crossing, a bow rail you claimed, coins you dropped for the divers in Avalon Harbor, or an arrival that the whole town came to watch, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take the SS Catalina or another island steamer where the boat was the only way across?